Good evening. Today's live is going to be on some of the things that you need to look out for when you're doing building work. So I'm involved in a lot of building work with a lot of contractors, subcontractors, and what could possibly go wrong. Well, lots to be honest with you, and lots of stuff does go wrong. At the minute, the biggest headache is trying to get materials and then trying to get them for a decent price. I mean, that's an oxymoron. It just doesn't exist right now. Things are absolutely crazy. But I'm going to share with you some of my top tips for you. I've got a list of 20 here, but don't worry, I'm not going to go through all 20 today. I'll do 10 today, and I'll then do 10 for you next week, so that you'll have a list of 20. And if you use these, you'll find them useful, I hope. And these are based on my own experience of having done construction work from very small commercial conversions and small new builds. The smallest I've done is 5 2-bedroom flats to 49 houses that I'm working on right now, and 21 flats is the biggest conversion I've done so far. But I'm working on something bigger, which I'll share with you at some other point. It's just going through the planning process as I speak. As always, if you've got any questions, post them in the comments. Happy to answer them. If you think of questions later, which sometimes happens, send them over by email, Facebook, WhatsApp, whichever mechanism you use. I get messages coming from or different forms of social media and phone messaging services, and I'll answer it at the next live next week or whenever you send your questions. So my first tip for you is always make sure you've done your homework and your research. And I can't over egg this in any shape, way, form, act, or manner, simply because way too many people go into doing deals and they haven't done all their homework and their due diligence on a particular deal. So this isn't just about the appraisal. This is about knowing everything about the area, the property, the planning consent, so that you know exactly what you're going into. Because lots of people end up doing deals because they like a particular property, and there's a certain amount of hope, sometimes a certain amount of desperation, because they've done a lot of groundwork, that they've invested in education, in courses, mentoring, etc., and they're kind of gasping to do a deal. They've saved up some funds. Let's call it 100 grand for the purpose of this conversation. They've got 100 grand in their pocket. It's burning a hole, so they end up very quickly putting money into a particular deal, and before they know it, they were so enthusiastic about actually doing the deal that they forget to do the basics and end up having pretty much what I would call a dud deal, as in it's not just not going to make them money, it's going to cost them money. So halfway through, for example, work stops and it's a catastrophe. And I can share story after story after story of people who approach me and have approached me over the years who've had this particular situation and scenario where, because they failed to do their homework and their research, things went wrong. So spend a lot of time doing your due diligence on the deal and make sure that the numbers add up. And if you're doing an appraisal, and if you're not experienced and you don't have a project manager, then I would suggest you speak to a quantity surveyor and get them to do that for you, or at least check the numbers. And then if you're working with a contractor or a builder, then you can obviously get them to check the numbers for you too. The second one is, if you're not experienced in property, then when you're buying a property, make sure you take a building surveyor around the property, because they will pick up things for you which you may not, and something may not be obvious to you, which will be very obvious to a building surveyor. And this could be from anything from minor works to major stuff. It could be something structural, it could be something to do with the roof. And if you don't pick up those things, how the law works is buyer beware. So if you don't pick it up, it's your problem. There's no such thing as sold as seen. You're not buying a car here, you're buying something more expensive. And if you get it wrong, it's going to be very, very costly. And a building surveyor will pick up certain things for you, that which gives you two advantages. One is you can try and renegotiate the price, but secondly is you're going into it with your eyes open, so you know exactly what you need to do, so you can build that into your appraisal system. So that's exceptionally important. Third one, again, sometimes overlooked, make sure you check the planning consent. If it's a listed building, make sure it's got listed building consent. If it's in a conservation area, make sure you meet those rules and regulations, and then do everything within the stipulated planning permission and also the building regs. Again, I've heard of horror stories where people have started work on a listed building and they didn't have listed building consent. Well, that is a criminal offense, and it's going to get into deep trouble. So make sure you check those things. If you work with a good solicitor who specializes in property, they'll be able to pick up some of these things for you. But you still need to do some of the heavy lifting, and it's extremely important. And I can't overemphasize this particular point. I also sit kind of on the other side in terms of being a city councillor, and I used to sit on the planning committee in terms of planning permission. And sometimes people get planning permission for certain things and they don't always follow it. I'll give you an example. Had an applicant who had planning permission to build a small kind of bungalow annex at the back of the house, 5 meters by I think 2 meters or something like that. I can't remember the exact size. And he overbuilt by 2 meters. And for some reason, he thought that would be okay. Well, the council obviously picked up on it, and then they made him demolish the entire building, and there was nothing he could do because even if he subsequently attempted to apply for retrospective planning permission, the local authority made it clear he was not going to get granted planning permission whatsoever. So he had to, A, he paid for the works, B, he had to then pay to knock the whole thing down. So it can get as bad as that, and the local authority will enforce that, and they take a very dim view of anybody who doesn't follow the planning permission to the exact measurements as per the approval. Number 4 is when you're doing developments, one thing for sure is they take up a lot of cash very, very, very quickly. So you'll be pumping in a lot of money into a property deal, and you're going to pretty much feel skint, and you can never overestimate that. So it's extremely important you look after the pennies, because as the old saying goes, look after the pennies and the pounds will look after themselves. So I'm not talking about skimping on fees and not paying, finding cheap stuff. I'm saying be sensible about stuff, get good value for money, because you're going to be spending a lot of money on surveys, on consultants, on contractors, on subcontractors, on materials, which I'm going to come to in a second. So make sure you always get good value for money, shop around, and get the best price possible for the best value as well. And that, by the way, isn't going cheap, because cheap usually means you've got to do the job twice and it ends up costing you more anyway. Number 5 is when you're ordering materials, especially if you're doing this on your own, there's sometimes a tendency to order just enough in terms of how much you need. Well, if you order just enough tiles, there's breakage there, and then you've got to go back and you've got to order some more tiles, and that's going to cause delays. It's going to cost you extra money. It might cost you to pay for a second delivery, and it would have just been easier if you ordered an extra 10-15% on your first order. So when you're ordering stuff, order more than what you need. You'll be surprised. You're going to end up using more than what you thought you needed. If there's some spares left over, you can obviously use them for a future project, or you can sell them on if you wanted to. Selling on, but by the way, it doesn't usually work because A, you haven't got enough of it. B, whatever anybody's going to pay you isn't going to be worth you going through all that rigmarole. So just order more than what you need. And because I've fallen prey or victim to this particular point a couple of times, and I've learned from my hard lessons. So now I always overorder, and even though I've overordered by 10 or 15%, in the end, I've just got enough for what I needed. So make sure you don't underorder. Number 6, this is a huge temptation, because when we see a deal, we've spent time on it, we're emotionally attached, we like a building, or we like a piece of land, we like the location, so we become emotionally attached to it, and before we know it, now we're trying to find different ways to make the deal work. And often where people try really hard to make the deal work is they end up underestimating costs. So they think they'll get the bathrooms cheaper, they'll get the kitchens cheaper, they'll be able to do some of the work cheaper, the plumbing, the electrics. Well, right now, everything is through the roof, guys and girls. And I can tell you, try and get a hold of a plumber, try and get a hold of an electrician. You got no hope in hell, because I've been trying for the last 4 weeks and we're building 49 houses. So these are significant projects, and we're struggling to find personnel with the right experience who can do the job on the time that we want. And by the way, we're willing to pay market rates, whatever those rates are right now, because we're working towards a deadline. So don't underestimate costs, overestimate costs. Have your contingency, prepare for the worst case scenario, so that when you overachieve, overperform, you'll have a better profit margin there. You'd rather have that than under egging it and then finding out you haven't got enough money. The bank's giving you less because your appraiser said you're going to be more efficient than you thought you were, and therefore now you're stuck for cash flow, and you're stuck because you've got to spend more money. You haven't got the money, and then that's just going to be a whole nightmare. So do not underestimate costs. Number 7 is, and this is more true for smaller projects, flips, and conversions, is only spend money on what you need to. So the windows don't need replacing, don't replace them. If the bathroom doesn't need replacing, don't replace it. This isn't a vanity project. Just replace the stuff that really you ought to be replacing. And certain things have probably been in a property or a house for a while. So if it's like a 1930s house or a house prior to that, some of the stuff's going to be really good quality. So you will be asking yourself, do I need to replace this, or can I repair it? And will a repair be sufficient, and will it do a good enough job? And the answer usually is yes. So replacement isn't always the answer, especially for older buildings. Repair sometimes can work better. Make sure you explore that in detail. Number 8, even though you may have a builder that you know or you've worked with in the past, that's fantastic. I would still recommend you get at least 3 quotes from reputable builders. Have a schedule of works, so they're all quoting on exactly the same thing, like for like basis, so you can very easily compare exactly what you are getting. Because one of the obvious and common things that builders do quite often, for good reason usually, is they end up charging you for variations. So you've either changed your mind or you didn't spec the job properly, and now let's say it's 150 grand job for a conversion or a refurb, and the variations coming at an extra 50 grand. Well, that's a 33% increase on your initial budget. That is not going to work well at all. So make sure you give a detailed spec. Make sure you stick to the spec. You don't change your mind where possible. So you reduce and eliminate variations, and you get the best price possible. Number 9, most builders are fantastic, just like most other tradespeople and professionals, but you do get some who don't have such a great reputation. So it's important you find a builder who is good at their job. So I'm just going to share some of things I think, or tips that I think you need to be looking out for when working with a builder. The first one is always ask for references. So at least 3 references. Where possible, go and have a look at those jobs. Ideally, look at one of their current jobs that they're working on, where a property is vacant or empty, so you can go around, have a look. But look at some of their old jobs. Now, you may not be able to go into a home but that they've done because somebody's occupying it, and they're not exactly going to be receptive to you knocking the door and saying, can I have a look at the work that you've done? But at least from the outside, you'll get some kind of an impression. If you can go inside, good, but look at some of the jobs. Now, secondly, you've talked to the builder, and you've got to be confident that they are able to do the job that you need them to do within the time and the budget. Now, usually, and if you heard me before, you'll have heard I say doing things on time and on budget doesn't really work in property. Either it's on time or it's on budget. If you can do both, you're doing exceptionally well. But at least speak to the builder or the contractor and make sure there's an agreement that you're going to aim to do both. Make sure that the builder understands exactly what's required and involved, and make sure that they've done that type of work before, because you don't want to be the guinea pig. You don't want them testing stuff on you because they want to have a go. You're not into the business of having a go. You're in the business of paying people good money to do a good job, because that's extremely important. Talking to previous customers is extremely important. But also what's important is make sure you connect and gel with a builder, so that you have a personal rapport, understanding, mutual trust and respect. Because if you don't have that, 101 different moving parts and variables, things inevitably go wrong. Tough conversations need to be had. If you're on the same page, you've got similar values, it's more likely you'll both be able to communicate and understand one another, therefore be able to overcome issues and challenges, because you're gonna face problems. There's no doubt about that whatsoever. But if you don't get on personally or professionally, then you're going to have a problem. Now, when you're talking to their previous uh, customers, clients, call them what you like, some of the things that you ought to ask them about is, what was the builder like to work with? Did they do the stuff on time? Did they do it within budget? Was the work to their satisfactory standard? As in, did they get what they were promised from the outset? If not, find out where there were shortcomings, and if in doubt, leave it out, move on. Also, you want to find out were they neat, tidy, reasonably quiet, because if you got neighboring properties, the last thing you want to do is annoy your neighbors and have complaints, and then the council coming around, the police coming around. I've had all of that from people as well, by the way, especially on bigger developments. Not because the builders were noisy, but because certain people weren't happy with the particular development, and they were carrying a grudge from the previous applicant from whom I bought the piece of land. And sometimes you just can't help that. But if people are neat, tidy, and quiet and reasonable, that's going to avoid some of the headache. And the most important question to ask people is, would you use this builder again? If the answer is no, I'd say stay away from the builder. If the answer is yes, find out why they would use that builder again, because there's nothing better than a recommendation from an existing or previous customer who thinks the builder was a fantastic person to work with. Number 10, don't use the wrong materials. So you want to make sure when you're replacing items, you're using the right type of materials which are fit for purpose. Obviously, there are moving parts here in terms of energy efficiency. So if you can have items which are energy efficient, it's good for you, both from an EPC rating, but also it's going to be attractive to the person who's looking to buy your property if you're looking to sell. And so you want to make sure you always use the right materials. And if there are certain stipulations or conditions in the planning consent, then make sure you follow that to the letter, because if you don't, again, the local authority building inspector will take a very dim view. So you got to make sure you're using the right stuff all the time, and don't try and go to get something cheaper where you think this might work. This might work, doesn't usually work. So stick to the rules, make sure you're buying the right stuff to do the right job. So those are my first top 10 tips for you. On the live next week, I'll cover my next 10 tips. So like you have 20 altogether. Some of these might be known to you. You may have come across them before, but hopefully you'll find at least one or two which you find useful. Any questions, post them now or later, and I'll answer them for you next week. Have a great evening and see you next week. Bye for now.